Hello everyone. Tonight we are journeying back to a time of sandals, spears, and suspiciously intense mother-son relationships. Yes, we're talking about Alexander the Great. Picture this, a dusty courtyard in ancient Macedon. Boy, barely taller than a spear is, hurling javelins at a wooden post, while his father, King Philip II, watches from a marble bench, arms crossed, unimpressed. The goats bleat in the distance. The boy misses the mark by an inch and mutters, something Aristotle probably wouldn't approve of. That's our guy. And just so you know, if you ever feel like your childhood was intense, Alexander got tutored by Aristotle, the same guy who basically invented logic and also had a mother, Olympias, who reportedly slept with snakes. Not metaphorical, snakes, actual snakes. You will not survive, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and time right now. I want to know if you're listening in from Athens or Albuquerque now. Turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soft background music, and let's get started tonight. From the moment Alexander took his first steps, he was taught one thing: conquer or be conquered. His father, King Philip, was no picnic, either military genius who reformed the Macedonian army and made sure his son knew more about cavalry formations than bedtime stories. While other kids learned to count sheep, Alexander was counting siege towers. Despite the royal pressure, Alexander was a curious kid. He asked a lot of questions. Why is the sky blue? Why does war never end? Why do horses poop so much? Questions Aristotle probably tried to answer between lectures on ethics and biology. And oh, the horse Bucephalus, the legendary stallion nobody could tame, except Alexander. Legend says the horse was afraid of its own shadow, and while the other grown men failed to mount it, 12-year-old Alexander figured it out. The trick: turned the horse toward the sun so it couldn't see its shadow. Boom, instant bond. Honestly, it sounds like a TikTok hack for horse whispering. By the time Alexander was a teenager, he already saw himself as a descendant of Achilles and Hercules, two men with anger issues and abs of bronze. It was a time when myths were almost real, and believing in your own greatness was considered preparation, not arrogance. But while Alexander was dreaming big, things at court were getting complicated. His dad married another woman, young, beautiful, Macedonian, and very much not Alexander's mother. The result: drama, whispers of succession trouble, and maybe a bit of teenage brooding with dramatic cape swishes. Here's where things get oddly specific. One source mentions Alexander attending a banquet where he and his dad got into such a heated argument that Philip tried to stab him, except he was too drunk to walk straight and fell over. Yes, the future conqueror of the world watched his dad faceplant mid-assassination attempt. Historians still debate whether it actually happened or whether it was just palace gossip with extra wine. Still, Philip had big plans. He had unified most of Greece and was preparing to invade Persia. But before he could hoist his banners eastward, someone stabbed him. Right in the middle of a wedding celebration. Some say it was personal. Some say it was political. Some say it was his ex-bodyguard with a flair for dramatic exits. In true ancient fashion, the motive is lost to time and probably poisoned wine. Alexander, barely 20, was suddenly king. And what did he do first? Murder a few potential rivals, secure loyalty, and ride hard to Athens to remind everyone who's boss. You'd think a guy might take a day off to grieve. Not Alexander. Greece had a habit of rising up the moment a king died, but Alexander recrushed Thebes so hard it became a cautionary tale. Only one house was left standing, probably so future poets could say, "Look, it used to be here." It wasn't subtle, but it worked. With the Greek city-states cowed into submission again, Alexander set his eyes on the big prize: Persia, the sprawling empire that once tried to crush Greece and now stood fat, rich, and divided under a king named Darius III. Little did Darius know, but his life was about to become a cautionary tale to. And as Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia, he supposedly tossed a spear into the sand and claimed it as a gift from the gods. Classic move, very on-brand. Meanwhile, back home, Olympias was probably lighting 100 incense sticks and reminding everyone that her son was descended from Zeus. Just casually. So now, with a loyal army, his late father's legacy, and more ambition than a 3-hour podcast guest, Alexander begins his conquest of the known world. and believe me, things are about to get wild. Alexander had crossed into Asia with about 40,000 men, some veterans of his father's wars, others fresh-faced recruits who probably thought this would be a quick victory tour with souvenir shopping in Babylon. What they didn't know, they'd be marching for years across deserts, mountains, and a whole lot of awkward cultural misunderstandings. His first major encounter came at the river Granicus, near modern-day Turkey. The Persian satraps' local governors thought they could squash this overconfident 20-year-old before he even unpacked his sandals. But Alexander had other plans, reckless, bold, and very I'm the main character energy. The Persians lined up on the far bank, expecting Alexander to wait until morning. Naturally, he attacked immediately, in full armor, across a fast-flowing river, with horses. A bad idea. Most generals thought so. But Alexander wasn't most generals. He plunged in, followed by his elite companion cavalry, and turned the chaotic riverbed into his personal stage. The Persians didn't know what hit them. It was here that he almost died, cut across the helmet by a Persian noble, only to be saved by his bodyguard, Cletus the Black, who chopped the guy's arm off mid-swing. Alexander lived. The nobles, Aram, not so much. That one battle cracked open the door into Asia. Greek cities under Persian control, like Sardis, began surrendering faster than a cat offered 2 bowls of food. They didn't love Persian rule to begin with, and Alexander came waving banners of liberation and tax reform, a very seductive combo. Here's something odd. After the battle, Alexander ordered the burial of the Persian dead with honors, a move that shocked both his troops and the locals. Was it diplomacy, guilt, a really dramatic PR stunt? Historians still debate whether he was trying to be noble or just theatrical. With Western Asia Minor secured, Alexander didn't slow down. He marched along the coast, taking cities like Miletus and Halicarnassus, where resistance flared up again. The latter was home to the mausoleum of Halicarnassus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Did Alexander stop to admire it? Possibly, but more likely, he noticed the local commander lighting it on fire, and muttered, "I just got here." Between battles, Alexander began reshaping how people saw him. No longer just a Macedonian prince, he started styling himself. As king of Asia, he kept local customs, wore bits of Persian dress, just the cool parts, and brought along scientists, geographers, and historians. Picture an ancient road trip with a camera crew and a lecture series. If Alexander were alive today, he'd have a travel vlog and a TED Talk. And then came Gordium, a small town with a big legend. There sat an ancient wagon, tied to a wooden post with a knot so complex that no one could untangle it. An oracle had said, "Whoever unravels the Gordian knot shall rule all of Asia." So, of course, Alexander showed up. He stared at the knot for a while, then took out his sword and sliced it clean in half. Problem solved. History, myth, or PR stunt? You guessed it, historians still argue about that one. Somewhere around this time, his men began whispering that maybe, just maybe, Alexander wasn't entirely human. His mother, Olympias, liked to tell people he was the son of Zeus, not metaphorically, like literally. Alexander didn't deny it. He just looked dramatically into the distance and rode off on Bucephalus. Among the army, morale was still high, but a few were starting to feel the strain. They'd been away from home for months, eaten more dust than bread, and probably hadn't seen a bath in longer than anyone cared to admit. But Alexander kept them moving with speeches about glory, honor, and gold. Lots and lots of gold. Along the way, he spared cities that surrendered quickly and destroyed those that resisted too long. The message was clear: bend or break. It wasn't diplomacy, it was psychological warfare with a charming smile. At this point, it's worth mentioning that Alexander was a walking contradiction. He wept at the tomb of Achilles, but also raised entire cities. He adopted local customs, yet never quite stopped acting like a Greek drama king. You never knew if he'd offer you a crown or a catapult. He also had a weird obsession with eagles. Supposedly, he believed they were divine guides, and whenever he saw one flying overhead, he'd interpret it as a sign. You know, like ancient Google Maps, but feathered. One day, a local oracle warned him not to trust his closest shadow. Alexander nodded wisely, then went straight back to camp and casually demoted his second-in-command. Coincidence, maybe. Superstition? Definitely. Smart politics? Absolutely. But all this was just the opening act. The true test of Alexander's greatness was still ahead, the moment when he would stare down the might of Darius III himself, across a dusty plain, in a battle that would decide the fate of two empires. But before that, a joke. Why did Alexander refuse to play hide-and-seek with the Persians? Because good luck hiding when you're bringing 30,000 hoplites and a siege tower. Darius III, King of Kings, had finally decided it was time to take Alexander seriously. After the disaster at Granicus, he must have figured, fine, if you want something done right, you might as well raise a mega-army and do it yourself. So, he rallied forces from across the vast Persian Empire, Babylonian cavalry, Indian elephants, Armenian, archers, you name it. Some historians estimate over 100,000 troops showed up to answer the king's call. Others say that's exaggerated. But one thing is certain, it was a lot. Enough to make the ground tremble and the donkeys reconsider their life choices. Alexander, meanwhile, was busy doing what he did best, not panicking. He led his army toward the town of Issus, in what is now southern Turkey, where he expected a smaller Persian force. Surprise! Darius himself was waiting there, ready to crush him like a bug under a royal sandal. The two armies faced off in a narrow plain wedged between the mountains and the sea. This bottleneck actually worked in Alexander's favor. Darius's massive numerical advantage was suddenly less useful in such tight terrain. It's like bringing a cruise ship to a kayak race. That as the battle began, Alexander took personal command of the right flank. He led a cavalry charge straight into the Persian left wing with the kind of wild enthusiasm usually reserved for people chasing food trucks. The shock and speed of the Macedonian assault shattered the Persians' formation, and soon Alexander was punching through to the center, aiming straight for Darius. Now Darius had a chariot, a fancy gold-trimmed chariot, and he thought it would give him the upper hand. But when Alexander broke through the line and came charging in like a heat-seeking spear missile, Darius turned around and ... ran. To be fair, it was probably the logical thing to do, but imagine the effect on morale when your king pieces out mid-battle. The Persian lines crumbled. What began as a battle became a stampede. The Macedonians were victorious. After the chaos, Alexander found Darius's royal tent, complete with gold, silk, and enough perfume to make a goat cry. There, he also discovered Darius's family, his mother, wife, and daughters. You'd expect a conqueror to take them hostage, or worse. But Alexander, in a strange twist of honor, treated them with respect. He even reassured Darius's mother that her son was still alive, though probably very embarrassed. Here's the odd part. He refused to sit on Darius's throne, not because it was cursed or booby-trapped, but because he considered it improper, until he had officially defeated Darius. That's either humility or extremely dramatic foreshadowing. From this moment, Alexander's legend grew. The Greeks back home painted him as a hero. His enemies called him a demon, and his soldiers, they just wanted some rest, and maybe a new pair of sandals. He continued down the Levantin coast, taking city after city. Some surrendered, instantly. Others, like Tyre, did not. Tyre was a fortified island city, a nightmare for siege warfare. But did Alexander give up? Of course not. He had an idea so absurd it just might work. He built a land bridge. Yes, a half-mile-long causeway made of rubble, sand, and determination. Under constant attack, his men inched forward for months, turning the sea into solid ground, and when they finally reached the city walls, they smashed through with siege towers and fury. Tyre fell, brutally. Even then, Alexander paused long enough to offer sacrifices to Melkart, the Phoenician god of Tyre, whom he associated with Heracles. Conquest and religion, one of Alexander's favorite 2-4-1 specials. By this point, his army had grown not just in size, but in diversity. Egyptians, Greeks, Macedonians, mercenaries from everywhere marching under one banner. And Alexander encouraged cross-cultural unity. He wanted to rule not just over people, but over ideas. He next turned to Gaza, another stubborn city. Defended fiercely, it held out longer than anyone expected. During the siege, a catapult snapped and struck Alexander in the shoulder. It was one of the few times he was physically wounded, but he barely slowed down. Instead, he called for bigger catapults. He eventually took the city and punished its defenders harshly. Yet afterward, in a strange display of mercy or fatigue, pardoned many civilians. Again, history can't decide if Alexander was being compassionate, clever, or just unpredictable. Now, An odd little story. Somewhere during these conquests, Alexander is said to have found a talking tree. No, really. In Egypt, or maybe in Asia. Depending on the version, the tree supposedly told him he'd conquer the world, but die young. A myth, certainly. But ancient kings loved ominous plant advice. As Alexander prepared to enter Egypt, he realized he'd done the unthinkable, defeated a Persian emperor in open battle, captured most of the eastern Mediterranean, and somehow made plundering temples sound like a spiritual journey. Not bad for a guy still in his 20s. Before we end tonight's march across blood-soaked coastlines and suspicious talking trees, here's a light one. What do you call a Macedonian who keeps breaking siege equipment? A catapult. Egypt greeted Alexander not with swords, but with open arms. The locals had suffered under Persian rule for years and saw the young Macedonian as a liberator. Imagine being so tired of your current boss that when someone storms in with an army, your first thought is, finally, some good leadership. Alexander didn't waste time. He marched straight into Memphis, the Egyptian capital at the time, where he was crowned pharaoh, living god, no less. And yes, this meant he got to wear one of those fabulous cobra-topped crowns that scream, "I now control both the Nile and fashion." He embraced Egyptian religion, paid respects to their gods, and perhaps most intriguingly set off across the desert toward a place most wouldn't dare visit, the Oracle of Siwa. Now, this was no quick side trip. Siwa was deep in the Libyan desert, surrounded by endless sand, scorching sun, and precisely zero Starbucks. But Alexander had a reason. He wanted to consult the Oracle of Ammon, a deity he believed to be the Egyptian version of Zeus, and maybe, just maybe, he hoped the oracle would confirm what he was starting to believe, that he wasn't just a king, but something more. The journey to Siwa nearly killed them. At one point, legend says, a pair of talking snakes, or maybe birds, depending on the storyteller, guided them through a deadly sandstorm. Again, this sounds ridiculous, but when you're half dead and hallucinating in the Sahara, anything with a tongue might qualify as a prophet. When Alexander finally arrived at the temple, the priests greeted him with reverence. What happened inside remains one of history's great mysteries. He asked the oracle a question. The oracle whispered a reply, and when Alexander emerged, he was quiet but smiling. Later, he would only say the oracle called him son of Zeus. No one dared argue. Back in Egypt, he decided it was time for some city planning, and not just any city, a new capital. Right between the Nile and the Mediterranean Sea, he ordered the founding of Alexandria, which would grow to become one of the greatest cities in the ancient world. You have to admire his modesty. He only named it after himself. Not Alex the Magnificent or Zeus Town Deluxe, just Alexandria. The city was designed with wide avenues, grand temples, and eventually the Library of Alexandria, which would one day hold hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Though he wouldn't live to see it completed, Alexander's blueprint for knowledge and power had been drawn. He left Egypt not just as a conqueror, but as a legend. He'd claimed kingship, godhood, and founded cities in a single year. You know, just your typical 20-something milestone. From there, his gaze turned east, once more to Mesopotamia, where Darius had regrouped and was preparing for round two. This time, the Persians chose a wide, flat plain near the village of Gaugamela. It was perfect for cavalry and chariots and for crushing Alexander's smaller army, or so Darius thought. Before the battle, Alexander reportedly had a dream. He saw a man in shining armor whispering that victory was his. His soldiers, meanwhile, just dreamed of not being trampled. Gaugamela would be their biggest challenge yet. Darius brought scythed chariots, elephants, and another massive army, some say 200,000 strong. Against this, Alexander had around 47,000 men. It didn't matter. With precise tactics, he feigned weakness on his right flank, luring the Persians in. Then, like a trap snapping shut, he launched his elite cavalry straight at the center again, aiming directly for Darius. Guess what happened? Darius ran. Again, he was developing a bit of a reputation by now. The Persian army collapsed. Thousands were slaughtered, captured, or simply ran in every direction. Alexander had won his greatest battle, outnumbered nearly 5-1, using brains over brute force. After the fight, Alexander pursued Darius but couldn't catch him. He did, however, seize Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia. The gates opened without resistance. The priests greeted him. He walked into the city not as a destroyer, but as a new king. Here's a fun oddity. When Alexander entered the city, a local seer warned him not to enter through the eastern gate. It was cursed. Alexander, being flexible, said, "Fine," and entered through a hole in the wall instead. Problem solved. In Babylon, he restored temples, funded local festivals, and impressed the people with his generosity and weird bedtime rituals, like sleeping with a dagger and a copy of the Iliad under his pillow. For security and literary inspiration, Babylon was the turning point. From this city of ziggurats and hanging gardens, Alexander could now lay claim to the heart of the Persian Empire. But his ambitions hadn't cooled, they had only expanded. He no longer wanted revenge or riches, he wanted to rule the world. And let's not forget the joke of the night. Why didn't Alexander get sunburned crossing the desert? Because even the sun was afraid to touch him. With Babylon secured, Alexander now pressed on toward the final remnants of the Persian Empire. His next stop was Susa, a city so rich it made Babylon look like a quaint provincial town. Gold, jewels, ceremonial thrones, Susa had it all. The treasure he seized here was said to be worth tens of thousands of talents, enough to pay every soldier handsomely, and still have enough left over to buy, well, probably an entire island in the Aegean Sea. In Susa, Alexander showed a diplomatic streak. He kept the satrap governor in place, allowed locals to keep their customs, and even returned certain sacred items to the temples they were stolen from. But let's not get too sentimental. He also helped himself to a golden throne platform, so he could literally and figuratively sit above everyone else. Not long after Susa came the Persian Gates, a narrow mountain pass defended by one of Darius's best generals, Ariobarzanes. The path was blocked, the cliffs sheer, and the ambush deadly. Alexander tried to storm through and got thoroughly repelled. His troops were nearly crushed under boulders and arrows. It was like trying to push through a really angry version of airport security. So Alexander did what he often did best, went around. He sent scouts to find a mountain trail through the wilderness, led a stealthy night march, and attacked the defenders from behind at dawn. The ambush had been reversed. The defenders were annihilated, and the gates to Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, were flung open now. Here's where things got dramatic. Persepolis was a city of marble palaces, columns, and treasures beyond imagining. Alexander entered in triumph, and at first he showed restraint. He offered sacrifices, honored Persian customs, and tried to present himself as the rightful heir to the Achaemenid kings. But then came the party. According to some accounts, Alexander and his companions were celebrating a little too hard one night when a woman named Tai, a Greek courtesan, suggested a symbolic act: burn down Xerxes' palace as revenge for the Persian sack of Athens over a century before. Whether it was a sober decision or a drunken impulse, historians still debate. Whether Alexander even gave the order himself. The flames rose high and fast. The wooden beams caught like dry grass, and within hours, the majestic palace was reduced to ash. Alexander watched from a balcony, silent. Some say he regretted it immediately. Others say it was exactly the closure he wanted. Either way, the torching of Persepolis became one of the most debated moments of his career, part triumph, part tragedy. Here's a weird detail for your trivia brain. Alexander reportedly kept a professional perfume maker in his entourage at all times, not for luxury but because he believed good scent was a sign of good health. So yes, this man conquered Persia while always smelling faintly of roses. Meanwhile, Darius was still alive, barely. He'd fled east toward the mountains of Media, hoping to rally one last army, but his own commanders had lost faith. They conspired against him, and as Alexander closed in, they stabbed Darius and left him to die in the dirt. When Alexander arrived, he found Darius already mortally wounded. He wrapped him in his own cloak, promised a royal burial, and wept not just for the man, but perhaps for the end of an era. The rivalry that had driven him so far had now been extinguished, by someone else's hand. To honor Darius, Alexander sent his body back to Persepolis for a royal funeral and hunted down the assassins. One by one, they were captured and executed, not just for treason, but for stealing Alexander's chance to defeat his enemy honorably. With Darius gone, the Persian Empire was now his. But Alexander didn't stop there. Oh no, that would be far too sensible. He adopted Persian clothing, married Roxana, the daughter of a Bactrian noble, and began to expect Persian-style prostration where visitors lay face down in front of the king. Let's just say, this didn't sit well with his Macedonian troops. They had followed Alexander through deserts and mountains, faced death 100 times over, and now he was dressing like a Persian, marrying foreign princesses, and expecting them to kiss the floor. The grumblings grew louder. At a banquet, one of his old companions, Cletus the Black, drunkenly insulted Alexander, reminding him that it was Greek blood that brought him victory, not Persian customs. Enraged and possibly wine-deep, Alexander grabbed a spear and killed Cletus on the spot. It was a terrible moment. He was said to have wept for days afterward, locking himself in his tent, refusing to eat. But the message was clear. This was no longer the Prince of Macedonia. This was a new kind of ruler, part Greek, part Persian, and entirely unpredictable. To soothe tensions, he organized a mass wedding in Susa. Over 10,000 soldiers married Persian women in one ceremony, including Alexander himself. It was meant to fuse East and West, but most of the Macedonians saw it as a forced cultural merger, and like most forced marriages, the honeymoon didn't last. Still, Alexander pressed onward. His next goal was even farther east into the lands beyond the Indus River. But as the horizon widened, so did the cracks within his own army. For now, though, the world lay at his feet, from Egypt to India. And just for the record, if you think your friend group is complicated, remember Alexander accidentally killed his bestie with a spear at dinner. Ancient drama was next. After Persia had fallen and the crown of Darius lay buried with his body, Alexander gazed eastward, and not just metaphorically. He literally pointed on the map and said, "Let's go there next." His advisors blinked, then started packing. The next target was Bactria and Sogdiana, wild regions beyond the known world, brimming with fierce horsemen, sharp mountains, and absolutely no concept of surrender. Alexander's army marched across the Hindu Kush, a brutal mountain range where snowstorms met rock. Soldiers froze at night, horses slipped off icy cliffs, and food was so scarce that oxen hooves were reportedly boiled for soup. Still, they pushed on because, of course, they were following the guy who smelled like roses and once torched a palace for fun. In Bactria, they met resistance like never before. A local commander named Spitamenes refused to kneel. He waged a clever guerrilla war, striking, retreating, then vanishing into the steppe. Unlike the Persian kings, Spitamenes wasn't interested in open battle. He used the terrain, the climate, and the sheer exhaustion of Alexander's men to wear them down. This phase of the campaign wasn't glorious. It was muddy, cold, and slow. Fortresses perched on cliffs had to be taken one by one. Ambushes lurked in every pass. Supply lines stretched thin. Alexander had traded monumental battles for a war of attrition, and he didn't love it. Still, he adapted. He built fortified cities, introduced intermarriages to integrate the locals, and used both force and charm to win loyalty. And in one rather infamous case, he even married Roxana, a noblewoman from Bactria, beautiful, politically strategic, and said to have stolen his heart. Now, here's a weird fact for your next trivia night. Roxana's name means little star in Persian, and Alexander supposedly saw her first during a hostage meeting, where she was pouring wine with such elegance that it reportedly captivated all eyes. Historians still debate whether this was love at first sight or brilliant empire building in disguise, but not everything was so poetic. One of Alexander's old generals, Philotas, was accused of plotting against him. Philotas was a decorated officer, son of Parmenion, an even more decorated general who had been with Alexander since the beginning. Whether the plot was real or the charges were just paranoia, Alexander had Philotas executed. Then came the harder part. Parmenion himself, stationed far away with control of the army's treasury. Alexander, fearing a revenge revolt, sent messengers to kill him too, without trial. This marked a chilling turning point. Alexander, once known for his charm and charisma, was now capable of preemptive purges. Loyalty was no longer enough. Absolute obedience was the new currency. And still, the fighting in Sogdiana dragged on. At one point, a group of local rebels took refuge on a cliffside fortress, a jagged, seemingly inaccessible rock. They called it the Sogdian Rock and told Alexander's envoys that he'd need men with wings to reach them. So naturally, Alexander took that as a challenge. He assembled his best climber soldiers, trained in mountain warfare and had them scale the cliffs under cover of darkness, using tent pegs, rope, and maybe just a pinch of madness. When dawn broke, the rebels looked up and saw Macedonian soldiers already above them, weapons in hand. They surrendered instantly. That's when Alexander met Roxanias, that same wine-pouring hostage turned bride. He married her not long after, in a ceremony that combined Greek and Persian traditions, signaling once again that he wasn't just conquering lands, he was reshaping them. But while the king dreamed of unity, his men dreamed of going home. Murmurs of discontent grew louder. Why were they still fighting? Wasn't Darius dead? Hadn't they already marched to the edge of the world? And why did Alexander now expect Persian-style bowing at court? To calm the ranks, Alexander began including more locals into the army, training Persian cavalry alongside Macedonian veterans. But instead of soothing tempers, this sparked resentment. The old guard felt replaced, not respected. Still, the campaign ground on amphetamines remained elusive until he wasn't. After a series of defeats, his own allies betrayed him and sent his severed head to Alexander, hoping to earn favor. Alexander, ever pragmatic, accepted the gift and gave them medals. No hard feelings. Now here's the oddball detail for this chapter. Somewhere around this time, Alexander supposedly imported a bunch of Greek actors, comedians, tragedians, and musicians to perform for his troops, because nothing says morale boost like Greek drama at the foot of the Himalayas. By now, Alexander had founded dozens of cities, all called Alexandria because humility wasn't his strong suit, many of which became real trade and cultural hubs. These cities weren't just military outposts, they were experiments in multiculturalism, with Greek temples next to Persian bazaars and soldiers marrying local women by the thousands. And then came a new obsession: India. Alexander had heard tales of giant rivers, golden cities, and warrior kings with armies of elephants. It was the final frontier, one last canvas on which to etch his name. But even as he dreamed of the Ganges, his army was tired, his leadership paranoid, and the distance from home immeasurable. Still, they marched east. Alexander and his weary but loyal army finally stepped foot in India, land lush with rivers, humming with monsoons, and thick with stories of riches, elephants, and warriors who wore more jewelry than armor. It was a place that seemed as mythic as it was real. The year was 327 BCE, and the boy from Macedonia had now become the man who would challenge the edge of the known world. His first test came not from a massive empire, but from a rebel prince named Porus, who ruled a kingdom along the Hydaspes River, modern-day Jhelum in Pakistan. Porus wasn't intimidated. He had war elephants, lots of them, 75 by some accounts. That's right, giant, armored tusk-flailing beasts with warriors on their backs. Alexander's men had never seen elephants in battle before. The horses panicked, the soldiers were shaken, but Alexander, he grinned. The Battle of the Hydaspes was one of the bloodiest and most dramatic of his career. In the middle of a thunderstorm, Alexander staged a bold river crossing upstream at night, tricking Porus into thinking the real attack would come from the front. Classic Alexander move: confuse, flank, and strike when no one's ready. Porus fought like a tiger. He didn't flee, didn't flinch, and didn't fold even as his forces crumbled around him. In the end, he was captured not in chains, but on horseback, still towering and defiant. When Alexander asked him how he wished to be treated, Porus famously replied, "Like a king." Alexander, amused and impressed, responded, "You shall have everything that a king deserves." Strangely, the two men became friends. Porus was reinstated as ruler only now as a vassal of Alexander. It was an unexpected turn of diplomacy from a man who had burned cities just months before. "Here's your weight." "What?" moment. Elephants weren't the only animal used in the campaign. According to one report, local guides showed Alexander giant ants that supposedly dug up gold dust from the earth. This is probably a wildly exaggerated tale, or, as historians suspect, maybe just marmots misidentified in the sand. Still, gold mining ants is a phrase you don't forget. But not all was well in paradise. By this point, Alexander's army had been marching for 8 straight years. They'd fought in deserts, scaled frozen peaks, and now had tropical bugs crawling into places no bugs should go. Morale was slipping. Discipline cracked. And when Alexander announced that they would continue marching east, deeper into India toward the Ganges, the army finally said, "No, That's right, mutiny, in the gentlest possible form. The veterans, many now graying and sick, respectfully refused. They didn't scream, they didn't riot, they just stayed put. And there, near the banks of the Hyphasis River, Alexander held a sulky, silent vigil in his tent for 3 days, refusing to eat or speak. Classic guilt trip. Eventually, he gave in. They would not continue to the Ganges. Instead, they'd turn south and begin the journey home. At least, what Alexander thought might become a very scenic loop, because if you're going to retreat, why not take the long way through uncharted rivers, hostile tribes, and another 1,000 miles of unknown territory? But first, there was one last war to be fought. As they moved south, Alexander encountered a tribe called the Malians and, in typical fashion, decided they should be conquered. During the siege of one of their cities, Alexander, ever the show-off, climbed a ladder ahead of his troops and leaped into the city walls alone, where he was immediately surrounded and shot with an arrow in the chest. The wound was deep, some say it punctured his lung, and for a terrifying moment, the world held its breath. Was the king about to die, in some backwater town, pierced by a rebel's bow? Miraculously, he survived, and to cheer up the worried troops, he personally sailed down the Indus River afterward, propped up on a throne, waving like a parade float. Still here, he seemed to say, possibly while bleeding internally. Here's a curious little side note. During their Indian expedition, Alexander's army reportedly encountered philosophers who lived naked under trees, refused material possessions, and welcomed death with smiles. Alexander, fascinated, actually invited a few of them to join his court. Some declined. One allegedly said, "Tell your king to leave me alone. I have everything I need." A response worthy of a mic drop, if mics existed. Eventually, they reached the Macron Desert, the final challenge on the return journey, and it was a nightmare. Water vanished. The sun scorched the earth like fire. Food rotted. Men and animals collapsed and died by the thousands. Alexander lost more troops here than in any battle, all because he insisted on marching through a region that even locals avoided. Why did he choose this path? Historians still debate whether it was poor planning, a test of endurance, or just sheer stubbornness, the kind that says, "I came this far, and I'm not turning back the boring way." By the time they staggered out of the desert, Alexander's once mighty army had become a ghost of itself. But they were home, or at least back, in Babylon, the heart of the empire. From here, Alexander hoped to rebuild, refocus, and maybe even conquer Arabia next. But fate had other plans. Back in Babylon, Alexander returned not as a conquering storm, but as a man changed by the weight of his own ambitions. He had marched over 20,000 miles, battled across deserts and mountains, stared down elephants and arrows, but now he faced the one thing he could never outflank, an empire. Stretched too thin, the city of Babylon welcomed him with a thunder of drums, the shimmer of gold, and more wine than any single human being should consume. For a moment, it felt like the old days: banquets, proclamations, new maps drawn with eager hands. But under the surface, there was tension. Alexander had left a lot of loose ends behind, while he'd been off sword fighting in India. His satraps, governors he appointed to rule various provinces, had gotten a little creative. Some acted like kings, others hoarded gold. A few even started executing their enemies without trial. Alexander, outraged, launched a brutal round of purges. One general was executed for corruption. Another was arrested for treason. You could almost hear the satraps whispering behind palace walls. Maybe he should have stayed in India. Still, Alexander had a plan. He always did. He ordered thousands of Persian soldiers to be trained in Macedonian combat style, and merged them with his Greek veteranza move that shocked both sides. He also encouraged intermarriage, holding a grand mass wedding where he and 80 of his officers married Persian noblewomen in one synchronized flower-filled ceremony. Nothing says unity like mandatory group weddings, but not everyone was thrilled. Many Macedonians grumbled about losing their Greek identity. Some even whispered that Alexander was becoming too Persian. He wore royal robes, insisted on divine honors, and even began to style himself as a living god, a move that, historically speaking, is right up there with installing a death laser on the list of things you should never do when your advisors are nervous. One odd moment from this period, Alexander supposedly commissioned a map of the entire known world, drawn on a massive slab of leather. It was rumored to be so big, it needed its own room. No one knows what happened to it, but one can imagine Alexander standing there, sipping wine, and poking at the edge saying, "Let's go there next." Meanwhile, trouble was brewing closer to home in Susa. Tensions between old Macedonian veterans and the new Persian recruits boiled over. A drunken brawl turned into a full-blown riot. Swords were drawn, men died. Alexander, furious, ordered executions then. The next day, broke down in tears and pardoned everyone left alive. It was one of many emotional whiplash moments that defined his final years. And yet, through all this, he was planning another invasion. Arabia was next. He'd already begun building ships along the Euphrates. Naval engineers were brought in. Maps were drawn. Supplies prepared. He wanted to sail down the coast, map the Red Sea, and eventually conquer the farthest lands imaginable. Spoiler alert, he would never leave Babylon again. In the summer of 323 BCE, Alexander hosted a massive banquet in the city's royal palace. He drank deep to deep, some said. That night, he developed a high fever. He collapsed, and over the course of 11 days, his condition worsened. Physicians were baffled. No one could agree on what was killing him. Poison, malaria, typhoid, a return of an old war wound. Historians still debate whether it was foul play, infection, or just the gods deciding enough was enough. Here's a peculiar little detail. As he lay dying, unable to speak, his soldiers filed past him one by one, silent, tearful, waiting for their king to give some final command. He simply nodded at them, weakly lifting his eyes. The final joke. When asked who should succeed him, Alexander reportedly whispered, "To the strongest, yep, that's right." The most powerful man in the world died without naming a clear air setting. Off decades of war, bloodshed, and chaos as his generals tore the empire apart, trying to seize power. Thanks for that, Alex. And thus, at just 32 years old, Alexander the Great, the boy king, the world conqueror, the man who wanted to reach the ends of the earth was dead. But his story wasn't over. Not really. His body was placed in a gold sarcophagus and taken, not to Macedonia, as some expected, but eventually to Alexandria in Egypt, where it was enshrined in a grand mausoleum. For centuries, visitors paid tribute to his tomb. Julius Caesar, Caligula, even Cleopatra. Then, mysteriously, it vanished. Today, no one knows where his remains lie. Maybe he wanted it that way. Oh, and one more weird nugget. His body was said not to decay for days after his death. People whispered that it was proof of his divinity. Others suggested he wasn't really dead, just in a coma, buried alive, and trapped in a golden box forever. Charming bedtime thought, right? But here's the truth. Alexander had done what no one before him had. He stitched together lands, languages, and cultures from Greece to India. He founded over 20 cities, spread art and science, and changed the course of history in just 13 years of conquest. He wasn't just a conqueror, he was a catalyst. The empire he left behind fractured, but the world had already changed. Greek ideas flooded east, Persian influence soaked west, and the fusion that followed, what we call Hellenistic civilization, would shape everything from philosophy to architecture to astronomy for centuries. So maybe, just maybe, he didn't need to conquer the whole world. He'd already rewritten it. The vast empire Alexander left behind was now a glittering prize without a rightful owner, and, predictably, it didn't take long for the chaos to begin. His generals, known collectively as the Diadochi, looked at each other, looked at the gold, the cities, the armies, and thought, well, I guess I could rule the world too. Welcome to the wars of the successors, a period of backstabbing, surprise alliances, and extremely ambitious men with even more impressive beards. At first, there was hope for a peaceful solution. The plan was simple. Alexander's half-brother Irenaeus, who had some cognitive impairments, would be king in name, while the generals ran things in his stead. And when Roxana, Alexander's wife, gave birth to a son, Alexander IV, the baby was declared co-ruler. Of course, putting a toddler and a mentally unstable man on the throne and expecting harmony was optimistic. The empire was divided temporarily among the generals. Ptolemy got Egypt, Seleucus took Babylon, Antigonus grabbed Asia Minor, Lysimachus settled in Thrace, and Cassander, never one to play nice, positioned himself in Macedonia and Greece, where he began scheming almost immediately. And yes, there were lots of schemes. Cassander, for example, decided that having a baby and a mentally challenged uncle, technically ahead of him in the line of succession, was inconvenient. So he had both Alexander IV and Roxana quietly executed. Very tasteful. Meanwhile, Ptolemy in Egypt decided to go full pharaoh. He declared himself the divine ruler of his own independent kingdom and made Alexandria his capital. He also stole Alexander's body en route to Macedonia and put it in a crystal coffin to boost his legitimacy. Nothing like showing off a dead world conqueror to say, "I'm the real deal." Antigonus, not to be outdone, tried to reassemble the entire empire under his rule. He called himself the One-Eyed because, well, he had one eye. Creative nicknames weren't his strong suit, but he was a brilliant general and won a string of victories that scared the sandals off the other Diadochi. Naturally, this led to war after war after war. Think Game of Thrones, but with more elephants and fewer dragons. One of the most bizarre alliances. Seleucus and Ptolemy teamed up to fight Antigonus at the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BCE. Imagine two men who hated each other pausing their feud just long enough to destroy a third guy, and then going right back to stabbing each other later. Here's your weird historical detail of the day. At Ipsus, war elephants were the deciding factor. Seleucus brought over 500 of them, which was basically the medieval equivalent of showing up to a sword fight with a tank. They completely blocked Antigonus's cavalry, won the battle, and changed the balance of power. Also, Seleucus named his first several cities Seleucia. If you're thinking that sounds confusing on a map, you are correct. At one point, there were more than 60 Seleucias. Even Google Maps would give up. Meanwhile, Lysimachus ruled in Thrace with all the charm of a tax auditor. He was eventually betrayed by his own family, defeated in battle, and had his body thrown to the dogs. Literally. Not every general got a fancy crystal tomb. The wars dragged on for decades. Alliances shifted like sand in the desert. Entire cities were destroyed, rebuilt, and renamed in the span of a generation. The dream of a unified empire died almost as quickly as Alexander did. But from that chaos, three powerful kingdoms emerged. The Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in the east, the Antigonid dynasty in Macedonia. Each one claimed to be the true heir of Alexander's legacy. Each one built cities, libraries, and monuments in his honor. And each one mistrusted the others so much, they basically installed panic buttons in every fortress. One moment worth pausing on. Despite all the drama, commissioned the construction of the Great Library of Alexandria Place, meant to collect all human knowledge. His successors poured resources into it, and it would become one of the most legendary institutions in history. It was like Wikipedia, but written on scrolls, and way easier to burn down. Also strange, after all the fighting, a statue of Alexander the Great still stood in every one of the successor kingdoms. His face was carved on coins. His image was invoked in battle cries. He was a unifying symbol, ironically, for a world permanently divided. Historians still debate whether Alexander ever intended for someone to truly inherit his empire, or if he just enjoyed watching powerful men squabble over his legacy, like kids fighting over candy. One theory: he wanted to create a system so complex and intertwined that no single man could dominate it again. Another theory: he just didn't think that far ahead. You'd be surprised how often world domination plans lack an exit strategy. So what happens? When the man who conquered the world dies without a plan, the world breaks into pieces. But here's the kicker: the chaos didn't destroy everything. In fact, the spread of Greek language, art, science, and philosophy only accelerated. Cities like Pergamon, Antioch, and Alexandria became cultural beacons. Greek theater thrived in Bactria. Philosophers debated in Egypt. Astronomers charted the heavens in Mesopotamia. Even in the midst of war, a strange kind of progress bloomed, and through it all, the shadow of Alexander loomed large, sometimes as inspiration, sometimes as a warning. By now, the world Alexander left behind was a fragmented mess of rival dynasties, power-hungry generals, and cities with confusingly similar names, but it was also a bridge to something new. The age of Hellenistic civilization. Welcome to the era where Greek culture went on a world tour, with no return flight. The Hellenistic period wasn't just about who inherited Alexander's sword collection. It was about what happened when Greek language, philosophy, and science met the cultures of Persia, Egypt, India, and everything in between. It was messy. It was dazzling. It was the classical version of globalization with fewer emails and more dramatic statues, one of the strangest cultural hybrids. In what is now modern-day Afghanistan and Pakistan, Greek kings ruled over Bactria, issued coins with Greek gods on one side and Hindu deities on the other, and built temples where Zeus and Shiva might have nodded politely across the altar. Greek philosophers debated the cosmos in Babylon. Egyptian priests adopted Greek geometry to better align the stars with temple rituals. And if you were a Macedonian soldier who settled in Persia, you might have found yourself learning Aramaic, marrying a local, and inventing a new recipe involving olives and pomegranates. And speaking of strange discoveries, the Hellenistic world may have invented the first known vending machine. According to Hero of Alexandria, Greek engineer, who apparently had way too much time on his hands, you could drop a coin into a slot, and it would dispense holy water. That's right, divine hydration for the devout. Beat that, Coca-Cola. In cities like Alexandria, science reached dazzling heights. Astronomers calculated the circumference of the Earth with shocking accuracy. Mathematicians like Euclid laid the foundation for modern geometry. Doctors performed cataract surgery with bronze tools, which sounds like a terrible idea, but hey, it worked. Also in Alexandria, a librarian named Eratosthenes tried to calculate the Earth's size using nothing but shadows and math. His estimate was off by just a few hundred kilometers. Today, half the internet still thinks the Earth is flat, so there's that. But the Hellenistic age wasn't all poetry and proto-vending machines. Power still changed hands violently. Alliances broke faster than a cheap amp. The Seleucid Empire ballooned and shrank like a nervous pufferfish, trying to hold together a realm stretching from Turkey to India. The Seleucid capital, Antioch, became one of the great cities of the era, cosmopolitan, chaotic, and full of philosophers shouting about logic while dodging camel carts. Meanwhile, in Egypt, the Ptolemies continued ruling with all the flair of royalty who read too much drama. They married their siblings, yes, still doing that, hosted opulent banquets, and built temples taller than anything Greece had ever seen. That, and what of Alexander's legacy? His name still echoed in every corner of the ancient world. Dozens of cities still bore his name. His tactics were taught in military academies, and every new king, whether in Egypt, Pergamon, or Pontus, tried to pose just like him on their coins. Tilted chin, flowing hair, dreamy eyes, basically the original Instagram filter. Still, not everything was glorious. The vast movement of people, ideas, and armies also led to cultural erasure in some regions. Indigenous languages declined. Local traditions were sidelined. Even the mighty Zoroastrian faith of Persia lost ground to the ever-expanding Greek pantheon. Historians still debate whether this spread of Greek culture was a gift, a conquest, or something in between. Was the world better off with more columns and tunics, or did something precious get lost in translation? The funny part, while these elite scholars were busy arguing in temples and libraries, ordinary people were just trying to live their lives herding sheep, baking bread, raising families under mosaic-covered roofs. A young merchant in Syria might have spoken 3 languages. A farmer in Anatolia might have prayed to Zeus in public and to an old mountain god in private. Life was complicated and surprisingly familiar. And if you're wondering whether anything actually unified this sprawling world, well, there was one thing. Drama. Epic, royal, family drama. Ptolemy's descendants in Egypt fell into bitter squabbles. One queen murdered her husband brother. Another, we'll meet her soon, would seduce Roman generals to hold on to power. The Seleucids had more civil wars than birthdays. And in Macedonia, the Antigonid kings tried to pretend they were still relevant, while Rome quietly watched from the west, taking notes. Yes, Rome. They were still just a minor power on the Italian peninsula, but they had big plans, sensible sandals, and an army that did push-ups before breakfast. For now, though, the Hellenistic world still sparkled in the twilight after Alexander. A new kind of empire had emerged, not one ruled by a single man, but one held together by language, ideas, architecture, and trade routes stretching thousands of kilometers. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't peaceful, but it was unprecedented, and sometimes, in dusty libraries or under the stars, someone would whisper Alexander's name, not as a conqueror, but as a myth, a symbol of what could be achieved in one short, blazing life. The world might never be united again, but it would never be the same either. By the time the dust of Alexander's empire had long settled, Rome, the quiet kid in the back row, had become the loudest voice in the Mediterranean. They weren't charming like the Greeks, mystical like the Persians, or theatrical like the Ptolemies, but boy, could they organize a supply chain. While the Hellenistic kings were still arguing over who wore the fanciest laurel wreath, Rome was expanding methodically, relentlessly. First they tamed Italy, then clashed with Carthage in the Punic Wars, and finally set their hungry eyes eastward, toward the fractured Greek world. The Greeks, ever the philosophers, saw the writing on the wall. Sadly, it was in Latin. Rome's entry into the Hellenistic East wasn't exactly a heroic charge. It started slowly with alliances, trade, a few politely aggressive ambassadors, and then escalated into military interventions, full-blown wars, and dramatic betrayals that would make even a Macedonian blush. One key moment, the Battle of Cynocephalae in 197 BCE, the Romans, using their flexible legions, absolutely dismantled the traditional Macedonian phalanxer tactic, once perfected by Alexander himself. It was a generational shift, like trading your war elephant for a spreadsheet. Some Greek scholars, witnessing Rome's tactics, were horrified not because they lost, but because it lacked style. One philosopher even noted that Roman soldiers seemed to value efficiency over glory, which is kind of like saying they showed up to a toga party in cargo shorts. In the years that followed, Rome played the Hellenistic kingdoms like a fiddle. They promised protection to weak rulers, stirred up rivalries, and then declared war in the name of stability. Think international relations with a passive-aggressive flair, and it worked. The Seleucid Empire crumbled under pressure from both Rome and Parthia. Pergamon, rather dramatically, was willed to Rome by its last king, and Egypt, while they were still holding on, but their grip was slipping faster than a wet chiton. Talk about one of the more unintentionally hilarious moments in Roman-Greek relations. The day of the circle in 168 BCE, a Roman envoy confronted King Antiochus IV of the Seleucid Empire in Egypt and told him to withdraw his troops or face war. When the king hesitated, the Roman literally drew a circle in the sand around him and said, "Decide before you step out." Talk about drawing boundaries. Antiochus chose wisely. He stepped back and into historical meme status. But as Roman influence grew, something unexpected happened. They got a little Greek themselves. They copied Greek architecture, hired Greek tutors for their kids, and even rewrote their gods with Greek names. Zeus became Jupiter, Ares became Mars, etc. It's like they conquered the Greek world and then said, "Wow, this aesthetic slaps, let's keep it." Roman generals returned home with carts full of Greek statues, scrolls, and philosophers, whether the philosophers agreed to go or not. Libraries in Rome started to fill with Greek texts. Wealthy Romans began debating Aristotle while lounging on marble couches, nibbling olives, and possibly mispronouncing every word. Still, not all Romans were fans of this cultural cross-pollination. Cato the Elder famously grumbled that Greek ideas would soften Roman discipline. This was the ancient equivalent of yelling at teenagers to stop learning French because it's not manly. Meanwhile, back in the Eastern Mediterranean, the once proud cities of Alexander's empire slowly became provincial outposts of Roman rule. Some retained their glamour: Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch in Syria, but the power had shifted westward, and, speaking of Alexandria, it remained a beacon of knowledge, even as Roman administrators kept one eye on its harbor and another on its ambitious royal family. At this point, you're probably wondering, where is Egypt in all this? Oh, it's coming. The last act, the big finale. It involves drama, betrayal, and a woman whose eyeliner alone could declare war. But before we get there, let's zoom out a bit. What made Rome's conquest of the Hellenistic world so impactful wasn't just the battles, it was the merging of systems. Greek science met Roman engineering. Greek art merged with Roman propaganda. Greek education became the gold standard, even for the roughest Roman warlord who barely knew how to spell Athena. And somewhere in all of this cultural fusion, something strange happened. People stopped remembering Alexander the Great as a man, and started remembering him as a legend. His story was retold in far-off lands, in countless languages, with embellishments that would make even his horse Bucephalus raise an eyebrow. Some tales claimed he was descended from a god. Others said he reached the edge of the world. A few versions even placed him in India, Arabia, or beneath the sea, battling mythical beasts. Historians still debate whether these legends helped unify a fragmented world or simply reflected its need for heroes in an age of uncertainty. What's certain is this: Rome may have conquered the Greek world, but it never quite conquered Alexander's ghost. His name still stirred something ancient, something proud, something fierce, and as Roman legions marched eastward, they sometimes found themselves walking roads built by Macedonian engineers, past cities named Alexandria, beside temples that still bore statues of a young man with a lion's mane of hair and eyes fixed on distant horizons. The world had changed, but the shadows of the past were long. By the time the dust settled over Macedonia and Seleucia, one kingdom remained as the glittering jewel of the Hellenistic world: Egypt. Not the Egypt of pharaohs and pyramids, but the Egypt of scrolls and lighthouses, of Greek-speaking nobles sipping date wine beside the Nile while discussing Plato. This was Ptolemaic Egypt, the last chapter in the story Alexander started, and ruling from its heart. Alexandria was the most famous woman of the ancient world, not just in legend, but in the pages of history. Cleopatra VII. Now, don't picture Elizabeth Taylor just yet. Cleopatra wasn't your typical royal beauty. She was clever, charismatic, politically savvy, and by the way spoke over a dozen languages. In a room full of sword-swinging generals, Cleopatra brought a scroll and a dagger and used both with equal skill. Egypt, by this time, was a kingdom under constant Roman pressure. The Ptolemies had mismanaged their finances, their politics, and, quite frankly, their marriages. Cleopatra's family tree looked more like a circle, but somehow she managed to climb the throne at just 18 and rule like a queen who had studied every chessboard on earth. She inherited a brewing civil war between two Roman giants, Julius Caesar and Pompey. When Pompey fled to Egypt, hoping for sanctuary, the Egyptians, trying to curry favor with Caesar, promptly beheaded him and presented his head to Caesar upon arrival. Plot twist: Caesar was horrified. The Romans loved drama, but not that much. Cleopatra, seizing the moment like a pro, had herself rolled into Caesar's private chambers, literally wrapped in a rug. Surprise! Inside was the Queen of Egypt, and she wasn't here for small talk. And just like that, a scandal was born. Caesar and Cleopatra struck up an alliance, both political and personal. They traveled the Nile, had a son, Caesarion, and posed for statues like a power couple on an ancient Instagram. But when Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, Cleopatra found herself in another whirlwind. Rome, never content with a peaceful succession, descended into chaos. And out of that chaos rose Caesar's heir, Octavian, later known as Augustus. Cleopatra then did what Cleopatra did best: she backed a Roman strongman. This time it was Mark Antony, Caesar's former general and all-around dramatic guy. Their relationship was part romance, part political maneuvering, and part opera. Operas had naval battles, golden barges, and enough wine to drown a legion. Together, they ruled the eastern Mediterranean, at least for a while. But Octavian played a better long game. He painted Cleopatra as a foreign seductress, Antony as her lovesick pawn, and framed the entire situation as a threat to Rome. Then came the inevitable clash, the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Octavian's navy met Antony and Cleopatra's forces in the Ionian Sea, and whether by panic, strategy, or miscommunication, Cleopatra's ships turned and fled. Antony followed, and his forces crumbled behind him. It was less epic final stand and more awkward maritime breakup. Back in Egypt, the couple made one last stand in Alexandria, where the sands seemed to whisper the last pages of a dying empire. And then, according to the most famous version of the story, Cleopatra, upon learning of Antony's death, took her own life with the bite of an asp. Whether it was a snake, poison, or poetic license, historians still debate. Octavian entered Alexandria and claimed Egypt not just as another province, but as his personal property. That's right, Egypt wasn't annexed to the Roman Republic. Like the others, it became Augustus's private kingdom, and with it, the Roman Empire was truly born. The death of Cleopatra marked the end of Hellenistic rule, the final breath of Alexander's legacy as a political force. From that moment forward, all roads led not just to Rome, but from it. But here's a strange little twist for you. Some ancient sources claim Cleopatra wasn't the last Ptolemy. Some believe Caesarion, her son with Caesar, survived for a brief time before being quietly executed. Others whisper he escaped into obscurity, raising goats somewhere far from politics. Historians strongly disagree, but haygoat farming is honest work. As Rome absorbed Egypt, they inherited more than grain and papyrus. They inherited centuries of mathematical discoveries, astronomical charts, anatomical scrolls, and philosophical debates, all housed in the great library of Alexandria. And while the library's destruction is a whole saga on its own, blame, fire, neglect, Julius Caesar, and probably a cat, its shadow loomed large in Roman intellectual life. Alexandria remained a hub of learning, even under Roman rule. Scholars still gathered there to argue over Aristotle, dissect frogs, and misquote Plato. Some traditions never die, and Cleopatra, well, her name lived on. In plays, in poems, in paintings, in Hollywood, she became a symbol of allure and power, of ambition and tragedy. But the empire Alexander envisioned, that blending of East and West, had now taken on a different shape, one that wore togas instead of tunics, and worshipped emperors instead of generals. The dream didn't die, it evolved. Strangely, in this final act, we see how fragile empires really are, not in the way they fall, but in how they're remembered. Was Cleopatra a queen, a tyrant, a patriot, a pawn? Was Alexander a visionary or a conqueror, or both? One thing's certain: the age they lived in left behind roads, cities, myths, and just enough ambiguity to keep bedtime storytellers very busy. Rome had absorbed the East, Egypt, Syria, Persia's old provinces, and with it, Alexander's legacy seemed firmly sealed within the growing shadow of a new empire. But if you thought the Greeks were done influencing the world, think again. Even though the political power had shifted, Greek culture had already embedded itself into the DNA of the Mediterranean. Like glitter after a birthday party, you just couldn't get rid of it. Welcome to the age of Greco-Roman civilization, where senators debated in Latin but quoted Plato for flair, and where Roman villas proudly displayed busts of Socrates and gym memberships to the local BATHHOUSE. What Alexander built wasn't just a string of victories, it was a cultural foundation. His cities, especially Alexandria, became model blueprints for urban life across the empire. Streets ran straight, a minor miracle in ancient city planning. Theaters entertained the masses, and marketplaces buzzed with languages from every corner of the ancient world. Now, here's the weird part. The Romans, who prided themselves on their own traditions, couldn't stop fangirling over the Greeks. They sent their sons to be educated in Athens. They adopted Greek gods just with Latin names. Even the mighty Julius Caesar kept a copy of Homer under his pillow. Okay, maybe not under the pillow, but definitely in the chariot glove box. But it wasn't just about aesthetics. Greek medicine, philosophy, science, and even gym culture, yes, ancient CrossFit, all flowed into Rome's bloodstream. Doctors studied Hippocrates, astronomers debated Ptolemaic star charts, and generals idolized Alexander like a mythical action figure. Speaking of which, did you know that Augustus, the first Roman emperor, reportedly carried a statue of Alexander with him at all times? Talk about fanboy levels. Still, beneath all this admiration, there was tension. Romans liked to remind themselves they were conquerors, not imitators, yet they kept borrowing Greek ideas, like a neighbor who says just one more cup of sugar, for the 5th time that week. And then came Christianity, this new faith, born from a Jewish sect in Roman-controlled Judea, spread through cities built on Alexander's bones. Paul preached in Corinth, Ephesus, Philippi, Greek-speaking communities that once flew the Macedonian banner. The New Testament itself, written in Greek, not Latin. So while Alexander likely never envisioned himself as a spiritual trailblazer, the infrastructure he left behind, roads, cities, a common language, turned out to be the perfect launchpad for a world-changing religion. And here's a historical oddity to chew on. By the time Christianity became the official religion of Rome in the 4th century, Greek philosophy was already being folded into church doctrine. Plato and Aristotle were invited to the theological dinner party, and no one even checked if they were on the guest list. Meanwhile, back in the dusty corners of the former empire, stories about Alexander took on mythic proportions. He wasn't just a king anymore, he was a legend. Tales spread of his journeys to the edges of the world, his battles with monsters, his encounters with talking trees and magical waters that granted immortality. Some of these stories wound their way into Arabic, Persian, and even medieval European literature, creating the mythical figure of Iskandar, or Alexander romance. And no, this wasn't just bedtime stuff. Some people genuinely believed Alexander had sealed away evil tribes beyond the Caucasus Mountains, using giant iron gates. A little extreme, but hey, plot twist. Even in places he never set foot, Central Asia, Ethiopia, his name popped up like historical glitter. Rulers centuries later claimed descent from him. Coins bore his face. Cities invoked his name to sound fancier than they really were. The man may have died at 32, but his brand, timeless. Yet for all his influence, we still don't know where Alexander's tomb is. No confirmed burial site, no golden sarcophagus, no skeleton waving a little "I conquered the world" flag. Historians still debate whether it was looted, lost, or simply never where we thought it was. Cleopatra was said to have visited it. Augustus might have seen it, but after that, poof. So we're left with a paradox. A man who tried to unite the world, whose body vanished, but whose influence never did. His vision of a connected world, a fusion of East and West, didn't survive politically, but it thrived culturally, through art, science, religion, and the countless little things we don't even realize trace back to him. Even the name Alexander became a symbol, not of empire, but of ambition, of boldness, of reaching too far, and sometimes just far enough. And if that feels like a good place to pause before we hit the final act, don't worry, we're almost there. Alexander may have passed into myth, but his legacy refused to stay quiet. Long after his bones turned to dust wherever they may be, the world he reshaped kept whispering his name. It began with the dreamers, generals, kings, and emperors across the centuries looked to Alexander not just as a conqueror, but as the conqueror, the benchmark, the high score no one could beat. Julius Caesar once stood at a statue of Alexander and reportedly wept, realizing he hadn't achieved as much by the same age. Napoleon, he devoured stories of Alexander and even carried a copy of Arrian's Anabasis on his campaigns. That's like bringing a biography of Michael Jordan to your first basketball tryout. Ambitious, maybe a little dramatic, but totally on brand. Yet, beyond these military fanboys, entire empires tried to revive Alexander's model. The Byzantines, those Roman Greeks of the East, framed themselves as heirs to his glory. The Islamic world saw him as Dal-Qarnayn, the two-horned one, a just ruler mentioned in the Quran. Even Persian poets, whose ancestors had been crushed by Alexander, reimagined him as a wise philosopher king in their epics. Talk about a legacy with range. Meanwhile, in the scholarly halls of Europe, Renaissance thinkers cracked open dusty Greek manuscripts, rediscovering ancient texts that had been copied and recopied in Alexandria and beyond. They found echoes of Plato and Aristotle and, by extension, the world Alexander had knit together. And speaking of Alexandria, the city remained a hub long after its founder was gone. While the famous library eventually burned, its archive of universal knowledge lit the fire for future institutions. From the British Museum to your favorite corner of Wikipedia. But perhaps the most fascinating thing about Alexander's legacy is how each era reinvented him. In the Middle Ages, he was a Christian knight. In Islamic tales, a just ruler wandering lands of mystery. In colonial times, a symbol of European civilization spreading eastward, which is ironic, given how many Eastern elements he embraced. In modern times, he's often cast as a tragic overachiever, someone who conquered everything but never truly found peace. And then there's the strangest detail of all. In the 20th century, Alexander made his way to Hollywood. Sword, sandals, and perfectly styled hair. Alexander has appeared on screens big and small, played by everyone from Golden Age heartthrobs to brooding action stars, always shirtless, always dramatic, always vaguely British for some reason. But even with these cinematic missteps, people keep returning to his story. Why? Because deep down, Alexander represents something more than just war and power. He's ambition made flesh. He's the what-if of history. What if one person could break down barriers, unite East and West, create a world where cultures met instead of clashed? Sure, he made plenty of mistakes, some catastrophic, others just odd, like the time he insisted on being called a god at dinner. But his boldness, his curiosity, that's the stuff that lingers. And here's one last juicy tidbit. Historians still argue whether Alexander's empire actually changed the world, or simply shuffled the pieces. Some say he just broke things the Persians already built. Others argue he laid the groundwork for a new kind of globalization. Maybe both are true, maybe none. The debate, like his tomb, remains unresolved. But what we do know is this: no one before or since has done quite what he did, with such speed, such scale, and such sheer force of personality. He died young, but he left a mark older than most civilizations. His story wove through centuries of conquest, art, science, and myth. A man who walked across deserts, climbed snowy passes, and stared at oceans he couldn't cross, and somehow convinced the world to remember. And so we arrive at the end of his road, almost. Because just before we go, we owe you something more than swords and cities, something softer, something for the quiet hours. The city of Babylon had seen many rulers, but never one quite like Alexander. By the time he returned there, his hair was shorter, his voice deeper, his eyes shadowed not just by years of marching but by something harder to name. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or disillusionment, or just the weight of trying to be a god. The man who had crossed the Hellespont at 22 now walked slower, leaned on others more often, and drank more than his share of wine. His campaigns had ended, not with a final battle, but with whispers of rebellion, arguments among his officers, and the vague feeling that maybe this was it, the edge of ambition. Babylon welcomed him like a king returning home. Palm trees swayed, musicians played, and his quarters were prepared with the finest tapestries and the softest beds. But none of that would matter, because soon after, Alexander fell ill. The fever came quickly, violent shivers, burning skin, and confusion. Some blamed malaria, others typhoid. Some even whispered poison, but historians still debate whether there was any foul play. We told you there'd be one last, no one knows. He lingered for days, drifting in and out. His generals asked him who should succeed, and Alexander, ever the drama king, reportedly said, "To the strongest." Classic. By June 323 BCE, Alexander the Great was dead. He was 30-2. And the world broke. There was no clear heir, no plan. His empire, stitched together by charisma and force of will, splintered within weeks. Generals carved it up like scavengers. At a feast, his wife, Roxana, pregnant with his only son, would face betrayal and loss in the years to come. Spoiler alert, it didn't end well for either of them. But here's the strange part of it: in death, Alexander refused to disappear. His body was supposedly preserved in honey, because why not? Ptolemy, one of his generals, hijacked the funeral procession and took it to Egypt, where it would become the centerpiece of a new political myth. People lined up for centuries just to glimpse the mummy of the man who had once tried to unite the world. Some Roman emperors visited his tomb, others tried to imitate his style, but eventually his resting place vanished, gone. No one knows where Alexander the Great is buried. Not in Babylon, not in Macedonia, not in Alexandria, just nowhere. His story ends, like so many legends, with a mystery. But while the man is gone, his name lives on, in cities from Egypt to Pakistan that still bear his name, in books and classrooms, in museums and documentaries, in that restless part of the human spirit that asks, what's beyond that mountain? And what if I just kept going? And so, as we wrap up tonight, let's leave Alexander not in the dust of Babylon or beneath the stars of Ashabot, in the quiet space between dreams. Now, breathe slowly. Imagine the endless deserts that once burned under his feet, now cooled by night air, the sands whispering forgotten songs. The mountains he climbed snowy and fierce, now softened by the moonlight. Picture a world where armies have vanished, where flags no longer matter, and where the only sound is the wind brushing through empty cities, once filled with noise. The great lion of Macedon is no longer shouting orders or drawing swords. He sleeps now in a palace of stone and stars, beneath a sky that stretches farther than any empire. The boy who tamed the world finally rests. The wars are over. The horses are fed. The maps no longer call to him. Only the quiet remains, so close. Your eyes, traveler, let the story fade. The journey ends not with a victory, but with peace. And in that stillness, may you find sleep.